The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but Eirik's words were clear. It started with the howling. Winter had come hard to the north, colder than any had seen before. The fjords had frozen at their edges, the long ships trapped in ice. The air itself felt cursed, thick with a silence that gnawed at the bones. The men were restless, huddled in their cloaks, waiting for the gods to grant them fairer skies. But the gods had turned away. That was when they heard it. A sound rolling through the fjords. Not wind, not wolves. Something deeper, something wrong. The villagers did not speak of it. They only shut their doors, barred their halls, and whispered prayers to gods who would not answer. By morning, one of the hunters was missing. There was no blood, no tracks leading away, just the sound of howling, still echoing from the cliffs above. And when Eirik looked up at the frozen ridge, he swore he saw something. A figure, standing on two legs, watching. And then it was gone. The missing hunter's name was Sten. He was a seasoned tracker, a man who could read the forest like the lines on his palm. And yet, when they found him, he had been lost like a child in the dark. Eirik and the others followed the only clue they had, a single set of footprints leading toward the high ridge. No tracks returned. They climbed in silence, their breaths fogging the air. The higher they went, the more the world fell away, swallowed by the cold. Then they saw it. Sten, standing there, frozen solid. His eyes wide, mouth slightly open as if caught mid-breath. Frost clung to his beard, his lashes. He had no wounds, no signs of struggle. But the look on his face, that was the worst of all. It wasn't fear, it wasn't pain, it was awe. As if in his final moments, he had seen something so immense, so terrible, that his mind had shattered before death could take him. And then, the howling. Louder this time, closer. The men flinched, gripping their weapons. But Eirik only listened. There was something about the sound that stirred in his chest, like a voice he almost understood. One of the men dropped his axe.
"We should not be here,"
he muttered. But Eirik stepped closer. That was when he saw them. The second set of footprints, leading away into the snow. They did not belong to Sten. They were larger, heavier, spaced farther apart, too far for any man to walk. And they did not sink deep into the snow, as if whatever made them was lighter than it should have been. The wind howled through the fjord, but Eirik barely noticed. He was staring at the tracks. They did not curve. They did not wander. They led straight toward the tree line, and they ended there. No sign of a body, no sign of struggle. As if whoever or whatever had been standing there had simply vanished. Behind him, one of the warriors swore under his breath. Another gripped his axe tighter. The fear was settling in now, thick as the cold. Then, the wind shifted, and Eirik felt it, felt them. He turned his head slowly, toward the trees. For a moment, there was nothing, just darkness. And then, a pair of golden eyes opened, then another and another. They did not blink, they did not move, they only watched. And then the howling began again, not from the cliffs, from within the forest, closer than before.
"We need to leave."
The warrior beside Eirik stepped back, voice shaking.
"Now."
But Eirik did not move, because the howls, they did not sound like warnings. They sounded like a call, and deep in his chest, where the cold had not yet touched, something in him wanted to answer. The warriors did not run, not yet, but they wanted to. Eirik could hear their breath quicken, could feel the tension in the air. The howls had shifted something inside them, inside all of them. A voice finally broke the silence.
"It's just wolves."
The youngest of them, Gunnar, barely whispered the words. But he did not believe them. Neither did Eirik, because no wolf walked like a man. And the footprints leading away from Sten's body were no longer alone. More had joined them. The eyes in the dark blinked. One pair disappeared, then another, and then they moved, silent, shifting between the trees without sound. And then the wind carried something new, a voice, not howling, whispering.
You should not have come.
The warriors stiffened. Eirik gripped his axe tighter. The whisper had not come from the trees. It had come from behind them, inside the village. The howling was no longer outside the walls. It was inside. The village should have been safe. The gates were bolted. The longhouse was sealed. Nothing had entered. And yet, the howling was inside. A scream tore through the night. Not from the forest, not from the cliffs, from within the longhouse. The warriors moved as one, racing toward the sound, boots pounding against the frozen ground. Eirik was the first to reach the doors, heavy wooden slabs reinforced with iron. They had not been forced open. They had been unlatched from the inside. That was impossible. But the blood smeared across the threshold did not lie.
Gunnar, get the torches.
Someone barked. Flames flickered to life, casting shadows that danced along the walls. Then they saw them. Two men slumped against the far wall, their throats torn open, blood pooling beneath their bodies. And a third, still breathing, still alive, barely. It was Halldor, one of the village's best fighters. He sat hunched near the fire, his hands clutching his stomach. His skin was slick with sweat, his breath ragged. Something was wrong.
Halldor.
Eirik stepped closer, but he did not answer. Then his shoulders twitched. A single unnatural spasm that sent his body jerking upright. The warriors froze. His fingers curled inward, clawing at the ground. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. His back arched, bones cracked. Then, finally, he looked up, and his eyes burned gold. Halldor's breath hitched, his chest rising and falling in uneven jerks. His fingers scraped against the wooden floor, nails blackening, thickening. Something inside him was breaking, or becoming.
Halldor?
Eirik's voice was steady, but his grip on the axe tightened. The warriors stood frozen, watching. None of them dared to move. Halldor's head tilted sharply, as if he were listening to something none of them could hear. Then, his jaw cracked. It unhinged, widening too far, a wet, sickening sound filling the silence. He let out a breath, but it was not a breath. It was a growl.
Gods,
one of the warriors whispered. Then Halldor moved, not like a man, like a predator. A blur of movement, faster than any human should be. He lunged. The nearest warrior raised his shield. Too slow. Halldor's claws ripped through wood, through flesh, sending the man crashing backward. Screams erupted. Axes swung. Steel met flesh, but it was not enough. The thing that had once been Halldor was not a man anymore. And then, the door flung open. The wind howled, and something answered. Beyond the firelight, just at the village's edge, more golden eyes burned in the dark. The pack had come home. The pack did not attack, not yet. They only watched, waiting. Their golden eyes flickered in the torchlight, their breath rising in misty plumes. More than a dozen, maybe more. The warriors inside the longhouse staggered back, but Eirik couldn't move. The change was still happening. Halldor, or what had been Halldor, jerked and twitched, his body convulsing. His bones snapped and reformed beneath his skin, muscles stretching unnaturally. The sound of it, wet and tearing, like flesh unraveling. And yet, he was smiling. A grin too wide, too full of teeth.
What are you?
One of the warriors whispered. Haldor laughed, a rasping, growling sound that did not belong in a man's throat.
What I was meant to be.
Then he turned to the open door. The wind shifted, and something moved. Not the warriors, not the pack, something else, a presence, heavy, ancient, patient. And then, the Alpha stepped forward. It was larger than the others, broader, standing taller than any man. Its fur black as the void, its limbs long and sinewy, and its eyes, burning, golden, endless. It did not snarl, it did not charge. It simply looked at Eirik, as if it had always been looking. It whispered. The word wasn't spoken. It was felt, deep in Eirik's bones. And for the first time since the howling began, he felt the pull of the hunt. The word pulsed through Eirik's bones, and yet Skull's mouth never moved. The pack did not lunge. They did not need to. They were waiting, because this was not a battle. It was a choice. Haldor, the thing that had once been Haldor, dropped to one knee before Skull. Head bowed, submissive, no hesitation, no fear. He had chosen. And Eirik, his breath came slow, uneven. The howls did not sound foreign anymore. They sounded familiar. Something deep in his blood, in his marrow, in his soul. It stirred. It knew. A cold realization settled in his gut. This was never about hunting them. It was about claiming one of them. And the pack had already decided.
You were not prey.
Skull whispered.
You were never prey.
The warriors behind Eirik shifted, gripping their weapons tighter. They did not see it, did not feel it. They were still clinging to the world of men. But Eirik, he was already standing at the threshold of something else. And the worst part? He wanted to cross it. The pack did not move, neither did Eirik. But something inside him did. The howls no longer sounded distant. They were in his bones.
You were never prey.
Skull whispered again, but this time, Eirik felt the words. They curled around his mind, his soul, a command, a promise, a claim. Behind him, the warriors were backing away now. They saw it too. Not the pack, him.
Eirik, step away.
One of them muttered, voice shaking.
Come with us.
He turned his head slightly, and for a brief moment, he almost did. Almost. But Skull saw it. The hesitation, the choice. And so, Skull acted, a blur of movement, faster than the eye could follow. Pain, white-hot and searing, sinking into Eirik's shoulder, claws, digging, marking. The warriors ran. They did not fight, did not wait. They fled into the dark. But Eirik, he stayed, because Skull had marked him, and there was no going back. Eirik fell to his knees. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision swimming. The wound burned, not like fire, but like something burrowing deeper than flesh, something taking root. The howls no longer came from the pack. They came from inside him. Skull loomed over him, golden eyes glowing like embers. The Alpha had made its choice.
You are ours now.
The voice slithered through his mind. Not a threat, a truth. The others had fled. The warriors, the men who had once stood at his side. He could hear them, panting, stumbling through the snow, desperate to reach the fjord. But no one had chased them. The pack did not need to, because they had already won.
Run if you must.
Skull murmured.
It will not matter. You will hear us again. The night already knows your name.
And Eirik, he did what no warrior should. He turned his back on the pack, and he ran. The cold burned his lungs, his legs shaking beneath him. Every step was agony, but he kept going. He ran until the trees thinned, until the ground sloped downward, until the frozen fjord stretched before him. And only then, only when the wind howled through the cliffs, did he dare to look back. The pack was gone, but the howls, they still echoed, and deep in his chest, beneath the wound, beneath his skin, he could still feel them, waiting. The fjord stretched before him, a vast, frozen wasteland beneath the pale glow of the moon. The longships sat in the ice, unmoving, their sails stiff with frost. But Eirik did not stop running, not until his boots hit the frozen shore, not until the village was far behind, not until the howls became whispers. Only then did he collapse to his knees, his breath rising in ragged clouds. The warriors who had escaped with him, those who had not been taken, not been marked, stood in stunned silence. None of them spoke. None of them looked at him. Because they had seen. They had seen what Skald had done, what Eirik had allowed. His fingers brushed his shoulder, where the alpha had left its mark. The wound was not deep. The flesh had already begun to knit itself closed, but it was still there. It would always be there.
He let you go.
One of the warriors finally muttered, not a question, a realization. Eirik swallowed hard. His throat was dry. He did not answer, because he did not know if he had truly been let go at all. The wind picked up, a sharp, howling gust rolling over the fjord. It should have been just the wind, but Eirik heard it. A voice. His hands clenched into fists. He did not look back. He did not need to. The night had already claimed him. They left the fjord at dawn. No one spoke of what had happened, not of the warriors who had been lost, not of the thing that had once been Haldor, not of the mark that now burned beneath Eirik's skin. They sailed when the ice broke, silent as the dead. But the howls never stopped. Not truly. They did not come from the cliffs anymore, not from the woods. They came from within him. It started small, a twitch in his fingers when the moon was high, a whisper in the back of his mind, just beneath the edge of thought, the feeling of being watched, even when he was alone, especially when he was alone. The others felt it too. They did not speak to him like they once had, did not sit beside him by the fire. They did not have to say it. They feared him. They should. Because Eirik feared himself. He had left the pack behind, but they had never left him. Nights became the worst of it. Eirik could ignore it during the day. The whispers, the pull of the hunt, the way his senses had sharpened in ways no man's should. But when the sun dipped beneath the horizon, he heard them. Not just the howls, the voices. Soft at first, like wind through the trees. Then louder, clearer, calling.
You are not lost. You are only waiting.
His fingers curled tighter around his axe, knuckles white. Some nights, he fought it. Other nights, he almost answered. And that was what terrified him the most. The men still followed him, but they did not trust him. Not anymore. The ones who had seen what happened in the village, those who had fled with him from the fjord, never spoke of it aloud, but they did not sleep when Eirik kept watch. And when they looked at him, it was with the same expression he had once seen in dying men. A waiting thing, like they knew the battle had not yet begun, like they knew he had already lost. One night, he woke to a knife at his throat, not an enemy's, one of his own men, a warrior he had fought beside for years.
I cannot do this.
The man whispered. His hand shook.
I cannot wait for the night's return.
Eirik stared at him, silent, still, because he understood. He might have done the same. He did not try to stop the blade, did not beg, did not fight. He only waited. And when the man's hand finally fell away, his shoulders slumping in defeat, Eirik heard the howling again. Closer than ever, the knife never struck, but it didn't have to. The warrior, the man who had fought beside Eirik for years, who had once trusted him without question, lowered his blade with shaking hands. His eyes said what his lips could not. He knew that Eirik was no longer the same man who had sailed with them, knew that he should have ended it while he still had the chance. But instead, he did something worse. He turned and walked away, and by morning, he was gone. They never spoke of him. No one asked where he had gone. No one searched, because they all understood. They were waiting for their own turn to leave, one by one. Until one night, Eirik woke and realized there was no one left. He had not heard them go, had not smelled the fire die, had not listened for the sound of retreating footsteps, because he had been listening to something else. The howls. The wind carried them low and steady, curling around him like a whisper in the dark.
You are alone now. Come home.
His fingers ached to grip his axe, to fight something, anything. But there was no enemy left, only him, and the voices that had never stopped calling. The fire had burned low, the wind had stilled, and Eirik was alone. Not alone like a man who had lost his crew, not alone like a warrior left behind after battle. This was something else, something waiting, something watching. He sat there for a long time, staring into the embers. His hands had steadied. His breath came slow, measured, because he already knew what would come next. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but soon.
You will return to us.
Skoll had said. Not a threat, not a promise, a certainty. And Eirik had spent his whole life defying certainty. He rose slowly, stretching out his limbs, feeling the ache of something more than exhaustion. The wound on his shoulder, the mark of the Alpha, was no longer fresh. But it was still there. It would always be there. The warriors who had left him had been afraid of what he might become. But Eirik, he was afraid of what he already was. The night was silent, no wind, no shifting trees. But still, when Eirik lifted his head, he heard it. A howl, distant, familiar, waiting. And deep in his chest, where the cold had never touched, where the fire had never truly burned, something in him howled back. The howl faded into the night, but it had never truly left. It lived in the space between his breaths, in the silence before sleep, in the hollow ache of something half-remembered, something waiting, something patient. A curse does not need to take you all at once. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it follows. And Eirik knew, deep in his marrow, that no matter how far he ran, no matter how many years passed, the hunt was not over, not yet, not for him. The fire in his camp had turned to embers, flickering red against the dark. He stood, feeling the weight in his limbs, the shift in his bones that had never truly left since that night in the fjords. And for the first time, he spoke aloud. His voice was hoarse, rough from disuse.
I will not return to you.
The words hung in the cold air, met only with silence. But deep in the trees, beyond the reach of the firelight, golden eyes watched. And somewhere in the distance, a howl rose once more, not calling him, waiting for him to call back. But as the night stretched on and the embers dimmed, Eirik stared into the dark and whispered,
Not yet.
"Some things do not end. Some hunts never truly stop." I found it buried in an old, crumbling journal, bound in leather that had nearly turned to dust. The pages were brittle, written in a hand that was both strong and unsteady, as if the writer had known time was running out. The name inscribed on the first page was clear: Eirik the Stormborn. I'd read plenty of Viking sagas before, but this wasn't just a story, it was a warning. Eirik spoke of a village deep in the fjords of Norway, a place called Skaldvik. He had not been born there, but he had seen its fate with his own eyes. And what he recorded, it should not have been possible. It all began with a storm unlike any other. The sea turned black, waves rising like grasping hands. The wind howled through the mountains, carrying voices that did not belong to the living. Thunder didn't roll, it screamed, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The villagers prayed to Odin and Thor, but the gods did not answer, because they had done something unforgivable. 3 nights before the storm, warriors had returned from the east, their long ships heavy with plunder, gold, silver, weapons. But among their riches was something different. A chest, sealed in iron, covered in runes that no man in Skaldvik could read. Eirik wrote that the village elder, Gudmund, had begged them not to open it.
Some treasures are meant to be buried,
he warned.
There are things older than the gods themselves.
But warriors are proud, and greed is blind. They broke the seal. Inside lay a single object, a drinking horn, black as midnight, carved with twisting figures that seemed to writhe under torchlight. They called it a gift of fortune. But Eirik wrote that from the moment the chest was unsealed, the air changed. The cattle grew restless. The dogs howled at nothing. And at night, the villagers began to hear footsteps outside their homes. Footsteps that did not belong to any man. And then the storm came. And Skaldvik was never the same again. Eirik's words became sharper after the storm arrived, his script rough, as if his hands trembled while writing. He wrote that Skaldvik did not sleep that night. The storm raged outside, wind and rain hammering against the wooden walls, but it wasn't the weather that kept them awake. It was the feeling, the creeping sensation that something stood just beyond the firelight. And then, Asgeir disappeared. A hunter, one of Skaldvik's best. He had left at dusk to check his traps beyond the village. He should have returned before dark. But he didn't. Not until midnight. Eirik was there when Asgeir finally stumbled out of the trees, his cloak soaked, his breath visible in the freezing air. He moved slowly, stiffly, his limbs awkward, his posture unnatural. At first, no one spoke. Then, someone called to him.
Asgeir?
He did not respond. Then Eirik noticed something. His boots left no footprints in the mud. A gust of wind pushed back his cloak, and his hands came into view. Blackened, frozen, fingers curled as if gripping something unseen. That was when Gudmund appeared. The old man did not ask questions. He only whispered a single word.
Draugr.
The dead who walk. Then Asgeir moved. Not like a man. No, it was a jerking, unnatural motion, as if something inside him was forcing the body to work. His mouth opened, too wide, as though his jaw had unhinged. And he spoke.
It is awake.
The voice was not his own. Then Eirik saw them. Beyond the tree line, just beyond the reach of the torchlight, figures stood among the branches, unmoving, watching. Dozens of them, tall, gaunt, their skin the color of frostbite. Their eyes burned blue like the last embers of a dying fire. None of them breathed, none of them spoke. But the wind carried a whisper.
You You should not have taken it.
And then, the whisper laughed. Eirik's writing changed after that night. The words became sharper, more frantic. There were sections scratched out so violently that the parchment had torn. Whatever happened next, it wasn't just a story. It was a massacre. The storm did not end, and Skaldvik did not see the sun again. The Draugr did not move at first. They watched, their hollow eyes fixed on the village, waiting. Then, one by one, the torches went out. Not by the wind, by something else. A presence, a force. The warriors of Skaldvik, men who had raided foreign lands, who had bathed in the blood of their enemies without flinching, felt fear. They raised their weapons, but the Draugr did not fight. They did not charge, did not scream. They simply walked forward, and Skaldvik began to crumble. Eirik wrote of Vidar, a man built like an ox. He swung his axe at the first Draugr that approached. The blade struck, but did not cut. Instead, Vidar's body froze where he stood, his limbs locking in place, his breath escaping in a sharp, pained gasp. His skin turned pale, then gray, then black, and in the span of seconds, he collapsed into dust. There was no time to react. The Draugr moved through the village, and everything they touched withered. Men dropped their weapons, their screams stolen from their throats before they could fully form. Mothers clutched their children, only to watch them slip from their grasp, pulled into the dark by unseen hands. The houses rotted in seconds, the wood collapsing in on itself, as if the village had existed for centuries too long in an instant. Eirik ran. He didn't lie about it in his journal. He admitted his fear, admitted his weakness.
I did not fight.
He wrote.
I did not cry. I only ran because I knew. You cannot kill what does not live.
He and a handful of survivors made it to the cliffs, looking back only once. Skaldvik was gone. Not burned, not destroyed. Gone. The land where it had stood was nothing more than blackened soil, as if the village had never been there at all. Only one thing remained: a single black drinking horn resting on the cold ground, untouched by the wind. And then, just as the storm had come, it stopped, and the Draugr, they were nowhere to be seen. But Eirik wrote that he knew the truth. They weren't gone. They were waiting. The surviving villagers, what few remained, stepped out into the ruins of Skaldvik. The longhouses had rotted overnight, their wooden beams collapsing inward, as if centuries of decay had passed in a matter of hours. The paths were gone, swallowed by the earth. The farms had withered. The livestock vanished without a trace. It was as if Skaldvik had aged 1,000 years in a single night. Then, the ground began to move. Not an earthquake, not a shift in the land. Something was breathing beneath them. Gudmund was the first to sense it. He dropped to his knees, pressing his hands to the frozen dirt.
It's still here,
He whispered. No one questioned him, because they all felt it too. Something was awake beneath the ruins of Skaldvik. The villagers ran. They did not pack, did not gather their dead. They simply ran. And by the time they reached the cliffs and looked back one last time, Skaldvik was gone. Not burned, not abandoned. Gone. The land where it had stood was nothing more than blackened soil, as if the village had never existed at all. Only one thing remained: a single black drinking horn, resting on the cold ground, untouched by the wind. No one ever returned to Skaldvik. There was nothing to return to. The survivors never spoke of it again. The name Skaldvik was erased from stories, from maps, as if the village had never been there at all. But Eirik wrote that some curses do not die so easily. Years passed. He had traveled far, raided distant lands, tried to forget. But some nights, when he sat alone by the fire, he could still hear the wind whispering through the trees. At first, he told himself it was just his imagination. Then, one night, he saw them, standing at the edge of the fjord, barely visible through the mist, watching. Their eyes still burned blue, their bodies shrouded in shadow. Eirik did not run, because he knew the truth. They weren't gone. They had never left. And then, from the darkness, a single figure stepped forward. It lifted something in its hand, something Eirik had seen before. The black drinking horn. And then, the wind carried a whisper.
You should not have taken it.
The figures vanished into the mist, but Eirik knew this was not the end, because the horn was still out there, and as long as it existed, so did they. Eirik's journal did not end there, but something changed in his writing. The words became shorter, less certain, as if he had begun to question whether writing them down was safe. The final pages were not about Skaldvik itself. They were about the drinking horn.
I have tried to destroy it.
He wrote.
The fire will not take it. The sea will not swallow it. The earth will not bury it. It is not meant to be unmade. And yet, it is meant to be found.
His last entry was unlike the others. No description, no date. Just a single line, scrawled in jagged strokes across the bottom of the page.
It is waiting for the next fool.
And then, nothing. No record of what happened to Eirik. No mention of where the horn went. Just silence. I don't know if he succeeded in hiding it. If the horn is still out there, buried beneath the fjords waiting. But I do know this. If Eirik was right, then Skaldvik was just the beginning. And I still have more of his stories to uncover. This was only the first of Eirik's tales. There are more entries, more horrors buried in these pages, and I intend to go through them all. If these stories truly are real, then the past is not as dead as we think. The journal's leather-bound pages felt brittle beneath my fingers as I turned them carefully, unfolding Eirik's faded handwriting by lantern light. The words he'd penned centuries ago drew me deeper into another world, one buried beneath frost and shadow, a world I'd learned to fear as much as I longed to understand it. Eirik's writing that night spoke of a forest older than memory itself. He and his warband had been driven there by winter storms that scattered their fleet, forcing them ashore near the village of Varglund, a place long abandoned, shunned even by the bravest Vikings. The trees there were impossibly dense, twisted together like skeletal fingers, as if they'd grown to keep something hidden, or perhaps to keep something inside. He described the forest as silent in a way that defied nature, an oppressive quiet that smothered every sound. Birds refused to sing, animals stayed hidden, and even the wind seemed afraid to disturb the eerie stillness. It was a silence Eirik said he could feel watching him, a quiet presence he couldn't shake no matter how far they traveled. Deep within these strange woods, Eirik and his men discovered ancient stones arranged in a wide, deliberate circle. Carved upon their moss-covered faces were faded runes that glowed dimly, casting a faint green light in the gathering darkness. He wrote how their glow drew him closer, though every instinct warned him not to approach. As Eirik hesitated before the standing stones, something moved just beyond the edge of their eerie light. From the shadows stepped a woman of unearthly beauty, pale as moonlight, her eyes mesmerizing in their quiet intensity. Her long hair shimmered gently, as though woven from threads of silver, and her voice was soft and musical, almost too perfect to be human.
"Strangers,"
she whispered, beckoning them with a slender hand.
"the night is cold and my hearth is warm. My forests is kind to those who respect its ways."
Eirik wrote of feeling a sudden, irresistible pull, as if his feet were no longer his to command. His companion Bjorn grabbed his shoulder in silent warning, clearly sensing the danger. But Eirik could not break free from her gaze, enchanted by the promise hidden behind her gentle smile. Only once he stepped past the rune-marked stones did he notice the flickering shadows behind her, figures warped and twisted, swaying in quiet agony, as if trapped between life and death. By then, it was already too late to turn back. I sat in silence, absorbing the weight of Eirik's final words on that page. Somehow, across centuries, I felt that ancient silence pressing in around me now, as if the Hollow Queen herself still lingered somewhere just beyond my lantern's fragile glow. I turned the page, my pulse quickening as I followed the inked lines deeper into Eirik's encounter. His handwriting became shakier, as though recalling this memory physically drained him. I knew by now to trust that sign. Whatever happened next had truly shaken him, a man I'd come to think of as fearless. Eirik wrote how the strange woman guided them through the shadow-thickened woods toward a clearing deep within the forest. Her steps made no sound on the forest floor, and though it was winter, her pale feet left no impression in the frost-covered earth. His men followed uneasily, torches held high against the encroaching darkness, exchanging silent glances as they went. Bjorn, he noted, kept close, eyes locked suspiciously on their enigmatic host. Soon they arrived at a large hut that stood apart from the surrounding wilderness. It was beautiful, covered in moss and ivy, nestled within a ring of trees, as if the forest itself had grown protective around it. Smoke curled lazily from the roof, promising warmth and comfort. But as they drew nearer, Eirik noticed strange carvings along its walls. Faces etched deep into the wood, their expressions twisted somewhere between agony and ecstasy. He wrote that their eyes seemed to follow him, pleading, silently begging for release. Inside, the hut was warm and inviting, lit by embers glowing gently in a stone fireplace. Freshly woven blankets were laid across wooden benches, and bowls filled with stew waited as though prepared just moments before their arrival. Yet, Eirik noted with unease, no servants nor any sign of others appeared to share this shelter. It was as if it had all sprung from the earth itself, waiting for their arrival.
"Eat,
The woman whispered, gesturing to the bowls.
rest your weary bones. Morning will guide your path home."
Eirik's warband, tired and hungry from their journey, cautiously accepted her hospitality. Yet Bjorn alone refused, sitting stiffly beside Eirik, his wary eyes fixed on the woman who now moved among the men with quiet grace. Eirik tried to eat, but the stew tasted strangely bitter, a flavor he could not identify. Earthy, heavy with herbs, and something else he wrote he could not place, but left his mouth feeling coated in an unsettling sweetness. As the evening deepened, the woman began softly humming a song that echoed eerily against the walls. It was beautiful, yet haunting, seeming to flow around the room like living smoke. Eirik's eyes grew heavy, and as sleep began pulling him downward, he saw Bjorn still awake, gripping his axe tightly, fighting the lull of her hypnotic melody. His final entry for that night was brief, scrawled with a heavy, desperate hand.
Dreams have come now. Dreams that are not my own. I see faces trapped in the trees, mouths open but voiceless, eyes wide with a terror. She stands among them, hollow-backed and smiling. The forest hungers.
My breath caught as I closed the journal, my own pulse echoing loud enough to drown out the night. Eirik's warning echoed in my mind, and I glanced nervously toward the dark windows of my cabin, imagining shadows outside, swaying silently beneath the moonlight. I hesitated only a moment, fingers lingering nervously on the edge of Eirik's journal before turning another page. By now, I understood the dangers hidden within these pages. Each word could pull me deeper into darkness, closer to truths better left forgotten. Yet, the hunger to know more outweighed any fear. The pages rustled softly as I revealed what Eirik wrote next, each line becoming increasingly frantic, as though he raced to record his memories before they vanished like smoke. He wrote of waking abruptly, shaken from restless dreams by Bjorn's firm hand gripping his arm. The hut was now eerily silent, the fire having died to dim, ember-red eyes staring out from the fireplace, casting strange shadows along the walls. Bjorn's face was pale, his eyes wide and fearful, as he pointed toward the place where the mysterious woman had stood earlier. Now it was empty, and the blankets that had covered their men lay scattered, abandoned on the benches.
They're gone,
Bjorn whispered harshly, his voice strained.
every last one of them vanished into the night. We must leave now.
Eirik rose unsteadily, his head spinning from the lingering effects of whatever they had eaten. He wrote that as he stood, the hut seemed suddenly different, older somehow, the wood rotting and warped. The beautiful carvings now twisted grotesquely. Their faces looked tortured, mouths frozen in soundless screams. He could not understand how they had failed to see it earlier. Together, Eirik and Bjorn stumbled from the hut into the chill night air, frost crunching beneath their boots. The forest stretched around them endlessly, the trees looming tall and silent, their branches tangled like grasping fingers. Eirik described the moon overhead as pale and sickly, casting a strange, muted glow across the clearing, making everything appear surreal, dreamlike, an in-between world he was not meant to linger in. As they moved cautiously through the forest, Bjorn held his torch high, flames sputtering and struggling against the oppressive darkness. Eirik noted how the shadows twisted and danced unnaturally, taking shapes that hinted at figures watching from just beyond the torch's reach. He tried to dismiss them as tricks of exhausted eyes and fearful imagination, yet deep down, he knew they were real. Then, from somewhere far ahead, they heard a voice, a familiar voice, trembling, pleading. Eirik recognized it immediately as Halldor, one of his men, calling weakly from within the trees.
Eirik, help me, please.
Bjorn froze, his grip tightening on his axe.
It cannot be.
He murmured softly, eyes wide with dread.
We saw him vanish.
But the voice called again, this time more desperately, closer somehow, and Eirik felt himself take a step forward, heart-wrenching with the urge to find his lost companion. Bjorn grabbed his shoulder roughly, forcing Eirik to meet his gaze.
Listen closely.
He whispered urgently.
That is not Halldor.
They stood in tense silence as the voice called out once more, now shifting subtly, twisting unnaturally. Eirik felt ice crawl up his spine as the voice deepened, growing rough, distorted, no longer human. Then, from behind, another voice whispered his name, sweet and inviting. The woman's voice, gently mocking, filled with soft laughter.
We must run.
Bjorn rasped, fear raw in his voice.
The Hollow Queen has chosen us next.
The last words of that page were barely legible, scrawled in frantic haste.
She walks behind us now. The forest will never let us go.
I shuddered, closing the journal quickly, glancing around my dimly lit cabin as the walls seemed suddenly closer, the silence deeper, and the night outside waiting patiently, whispering of secrets it longed to share. My fingers trembled slightly as I reopened Eirik's journal, feeling the weight of his dread creeping steadily into my own bones. The words on the page seemed to pull at me, drawing me back into the nightmare of those woods, closer to something ancient and malevolent. A creature whose whispers I swore I could almost hear echoing faintly through the cabin walls. Eirik's next entries were fragmented, hurried lines capturing brief flashes of his panicked escape through the forest. He wrote of running blindly with Bjorn beside him, their breath ragged and harsh against the oppressive silence. Behind them, voices rose and fell like a twisted choir, sometimes familiar, sometimes monstrous, always calling their names. They resisted the urge to look back, knowing somehow that a single glance could bind them forever to the trees. The forest itself seemed to shift around them, rearranging in ways that defied all reason. Paths twisted back upon themselves. Clearings appeared and vanished without warning. Eirik described feeling disoriented, as though they were trapped in a labyrinth that breathed and moved, guiding them inexorably towards something waiting patiently at its heart. At last, exhausted and desperate, they stumbled into a clearing ringed with ancient, towering oaks, their branches tangled high above, forming a cathedral roof of blackened limbs. At its center stood a single, massive stone etched with runes, pulsing faintly like a living heart. Around its base lay countless bones, bleached white beneath the pale moonlight, half hidden beneath layers of moss and fallen leaves. Bjorn froze in place, his torch raised defensively, flames dancing uncertainly in the still air.
Gods preserve us.
He murmured, his voice choked with dread.
We have been led here.
Eirik's blood ran cold as the forest grew deathly still once more, the voices abruptly silenced. For a moment, all he heard was the frantic rhythm of his own heartbeat, hammering loudly in his chest. Then, slowly, as if emerging from the very shadows themselves, the woman stepped gracefully into view, her beautiful face serene and unreadable in the flickering torchlight.
You run so swiftly,
she whispered gently, her voice soft, almost sorrowful.
yet all paths here lead back to me. This forest holds no escape for those who see my face.
Release us!
Eirik demanded, though he knew his voice betrayed the fear he desperately sought to hide.
Let us leave this cursed place.
She tilted her head slightly, as though amused by his defiance.
Why would you leave, brave one?
She asked sweetly, her eyes shimmering softly.
I offer you peace, everlasting rest within the forest's embrace. Many have found comfort here.
As she spoke, Eirik watched in horror as the shadows around her writhed and shifted, forming indistinct figures that stretched toward them, silent, pleading. He glimpsed hollow eyes, gaping mouths, faces he recognized, men from his warband, twisted and transformed, trapped forever between death and something far worse.
You see,
the woman smiled softly, her expression both kind and terrifying.
your friends have joined me already. Stay, and know peace.
Bjorn's torch flickered, nearly extinguishing as he took a hesitant step backward.
We cannot fight this.
he whispered hoarsely.
She is older than our gods, older than this land itself. She is death wrapped in beauty.
Eirik's final words on that page were scrawled hastily, ink smeared by shaking hands.
She waits patiently, knowing we cannot resist forever. The trees whisper that we are already hers.
I closed the journal again, heart pounding, and stared silently at my darkened window. Somewhere outside, beneath the moonlit forest that surrounded my cabin, I thought I heard faint whispers rising from the trees. Voices calling softly, inviting me to step outside, to join them beneath the watchful gaze of something ancient and endlessly patient. I took a deep breath, steadied my shaking hands, and turned yet another brittle page. Eirik's handwriting had grown more desperate now, barely recognizable from the steady script I'd grown accustomed to. His words spoke of a hopelessness that felt palpable, reaching out from the ink-stained paper to grip my heart with icy fingers. Eirik wrote of the moment he and Bjorn had fled the clearing, leaving behind the silent figures and the woman's haunting laughter. Their flight through the forest became a blur of tangled branches, clawing roots, and whispered taunts. Each direction they turned led them deeper into confusion, circling endlessly back to places they'd already seen. Standing stones pulsing softly, twisted trees whose bark bore screaming faces. Time itself seemed to lose meaning in those cursed woods. Eirik described how hours, or perhaps days, passed without a glimpse of sunlight or starry sky. Only the dim glow of an endless twilight filtered through branches that never parted. Hunger gnawed at them. Thirst burned their throats. Yet no stream or path led towards salvation, only deeper into the Hollow Queen's dominion. He wrote of the whispers growing louder, clearer, as if unseen mouths pressed close to his ears, promising relief from pain and exhaustion if he surrendered willingly. Bjorn became increasingly withdrawn, eyes hollow with despair, muttering prayers to gods whose voices seemed distant and indifferent in this forsaken place. Then, Eirik's words took a chilling turn. He described the night when Bjorn finally broke, how he'd awakened to find his companion standing at the edge of their makeshift camp, staring silently into the darkness with a vacant, haunted expression.
She calls to me, Eirik.
Bjorn murmured softly, eyes glistening, fixed on something unseen.
Her voice promises rest. We cannot escape her. Perhaps we never could.
Eirik begged him to resist, to hold on to hope even as it slipped through his own fingers. Yet Bjorn only shook his head sadly, offering a resigned, weary smile before stepping forward, melting silently into the shadows that swallowed him whole. Eirik chased after him, screaming his friend's name, but found only emptiness, silence echoing mockingly back. Alone now, Eirik wandered the forest, tormented by visions. The trees appeared to whisper secrets just beyond his understanding, their voices mocking him with every rustle. He saw faces trapped within their bark, Bjorn, Haldor, and the rest of his lost crew, all staring mournfully, pleading for release he could not give. Finally, stumbling from exhaustion, he fell to his knees near a small clearing ringed by ancient stones. In their center stood the Hollow Queen, her arms outstretched, face serene and compassionate, eyes shining softly.
You need not suffer.
She whispered tenderly.
The forest will embrace you. Your pain will end. Your friends await you, Eirik.
Her voice was soothing, irresistible, reaching into his mind, unraveling his will. He felt himself begin to rise, moving toward her open arms, yet something deep within him still resisted, a spark of defiance refusing to yield. His final line on the page was smeared, nearly illegible, but it carried the weight of a desperate resolve.
I will fight her hold, even if the trees consume my flesh. She will not have me.
I shut the journal once more, feeling chilled, vulnerable, as though Eirik's defiance had somehow placed me directly beneath the Hollow Queen's gaze. Outside my window, the trees shifted softly in the night wind, their branches brushing against one another, almost like whispers, urging me to step outside, to join those already lost to the woods. I could feel the weight of Eirik's words pressing in on me as I opened the journal again, his desperation pulling me deeper into the nightmare. His resistance had not come without cost, though. His next entries were fractured, written in quick, jagged strokes, as though he feared the forest might devour the very words before he finished them. Eirik wrote of a final, agonizing confrontation in the heart of the forest, a place even darker and colder than the rest. He and Bjorn had wandered farther into the wilderness after the latter's disappearance, hopelessly searching for any sign of the others. But the forest seemed to close in tighter with every step, as if it was no longer just a place. It was a living entity, aware of their every movement. And then, one night, after what felt like an eternity of wandering, they found it, the very heart of the forest, a place where the trees grew impossibly thick, their trunks towering like columns of dark stone, forming an ancient, unsettling cathedral of shadows. At its center stood a great stone arch, carved with runes older than any Eirik had ever seen. The stone was cold and slick, covered with an unnatural slime that glistened faintly in the moonlight. As they approached the arch, the air grew thick with an unbearable pressure, a weight that pressed against their lungs. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their roots twisting like serpents beneath the earth. Eirik felt the first stirrings of real terror, as though the land itself were conspiring against him, pushing him to his knees. And there, beneath the arch, stood the Hollow Queen once again. This time, her beauty more terrifying than before. Her skin had become almost translucent, veins glowing faintly beneath the surface, like blood-filled rivers running through marble. Her long silver hair shifted unnaturally, as though it moved of its own accord, twisting around her like a halo of living mist.
You have come far, Eirik,
she said, her voice low and melodic, but there was no warmth in it now.
Farther than any mortal should. You seek to defy me, but it is already too late.
The air around them seemed to warp and ripple, the very fabric of the forest bending to her will. Eirik's mind screamed for him to run, but his legs were frozen, his body unwilling to move as the Hollow Queen approached him, her long fingers stretching toward him like branches of an ancient tree.
He offers the peace of eternal rest,
she whispered, almost as if speaking to herself.
But you choose pain. You will never leave this place, Eirik, not while the forest lives.
Eirik, still struggling against the weight of her power, forced his body to stand. His legs shook violently, his breath coming in ragged gasps.
I will never surrender,
he spat, his voice raw with defiance. The Hollow Queen's smile twisted into something far darker.
Then you shall suffer as your friends have. You will join them in the forest's embrace, lost, forgotten, a part of me.
As she spoke, Eirik felt the ground beneath him tremble, the roots of the trees rising like monstrous claws, reaching for his legs, dragging him toward the earth. His body was pulled, inch by inch, down into the soil, the darkness closing in around him. But just as the roots were about to claim him, he heard a voice, faint but unmistakable. It was Bjorn's voice, twisted and broken, but still familiar.
Eirik, you must choose. There is always a choice.
Eirik fought to break free, his muscles screaming in protest. The ground was cold, wet, but he refused to give in. His fingers clawed at the dirt, pulling himself from the earth's grasp, inch by painful inch. Finally, with a great effort, he managed to rise, though his strength was fading, his body weak and trembling. The Hollow Queen's laughter rang out, shrill and mocking, echoing through the trees.
You are so stubborn,
She said, her tone filled with amusement.
but you will learn, Eirik. This forest holds power beyond your understanding. You cannot defy me forever.
But Eirik's final words on the page, written with trembling hands, were resolute, despite the overwhelming dread consuming him.
I will find a way to destroy you, Hollow Queen.
I closed the journal slowly, my breath shallow, as though the air in my own cabin had thinned, leaving me breathless. The walls seemed to close in, the silence growing louder with each passing moment. Something in the woods, something alive, was waiting. And I knew it wasn't just Eirik trapped in that nightmare anymore. I hesitated briefly, fingertips brushing the rough surface of Eirik's journal, the weight of his words now almost tangible. Each page I read brought his dread closer, as if the centuries between us were dissolving, leaving nothing but a thin veil separating my cabin from that ancient, haunted forest. The entries following Eirik's confrontation with the Hollow Queen grew sparse, as though putting the horror to paper drained what little remained of his strength. But still, he pressed on, determined to record his story, perhaps hoping that someday, someone like me might find it, learn from it, or even finish what he had begun. Eirik wrote of fleeing blindly after escaping the grasp of the Hollow Queen, his body battered, torn, and exhausted. He no longer trusted his senses. The forest twisted around him like a living creature, pathways shifting, trees whispering his name. Hunger and thirst had long since blurred into a distant, dull ache. He stumbled forward, driven by sheer determination alone. At last, he wrote of discovering a narrow path, hidden beneath twisted vines and tangled roots. It looked different, older, somehow untouched by the Hollow Queen's presence. A flicker of hope sparked within him, urging him forward into the unknown. The path led downward, deeper into the earth, until he stood before an opening carved directly into a massive, moss-covered rock. A faint light shimmered inside, gentle yet inviting. Eirik hesitated, wary of another trick, but something about this place felt different. He stepped into the cavern, breath held tightly, body tense with anticipation. Inside, the cavern walls shimmered with veins of quartz, reflecting a pale, ethereal glow. It seemed untouched by the corruption above, pure, almost sacred. At its center rested an ancient stone altar, carved with runes that pulsed softly, resonating quietly like a heartbeat. And atop it lay a single blade, gleaming faintly, as though waiting patiently for him. As Eirik approached cautiously, the whispers returned, softer this time, gentle voices urging him forward. He recognized one immediately. It was Bjorn, clearer and stronger now, his voice filled with a calm reassurance he thought lost forever.
Take the blade, Eirik.
Bjorn murmured quietly.
It is your only hope. She fears it. She fears what it represents.
Eirik lifted the blade from the altar, and a surge of warmth filled him, as though some ancient power had chosen him for this very moment. He felt it, a strength returning, purpose driving away despair. For the first time since entering the cursed woods, he felt a chance at survival. Yet the moment he touched the blade, the cavern trembled violently, dust and debris raining from the ceiling. The gentle voices faded, replaced by the Hollow Queen's furious laughter, echoing from above, piercing through stone.
You believe a mere blade can stop me?
She taunted, her voice thick with scorn.
You know nothing, mortal. This forest and I are one. You cannot kill what does not truly live.
Eirik's response, scrawled hastily at the bottom of the page, was defiant, fierce, and filled with resolve.
Even if it costs my soul, I will find a way, even if it means sacrificing myself to darkness. She will not have the final victory.
My fingers shook as I closed the journal again, a chill settling deep within my bones. Somewhere beyond my window, the wind howled softly, carrying whispers of a voice that sounded far too much like the Hollow Queen, patiently waiting, knowing I'd come this far, knowing I'd see this through to whatever end awaited. I opened the journal once more, Eirik's words guiding me further into a nightmare centuries old, yet chillingly close. His writing became steadier now, as though finding that strange blade had given him newfound clarity, purpose strong enough to momentarily keep the darkness at bay. He wrote of emerging from the cavern, blade in hand, its ancient metal glowing softly, illuminating a path he hadn't seen before. He knew instinctively the forest had changed, as if recoiling from the weapon he now carried. The trees drew back their branches reluctantly, their whispers fading into uneasy silence, as though uncertain how to deal with this unexpected defiance. But the Hollow Queen was not so easily thwarted. As he traveled, he began hearing cries in the distance, voices of men he had known, screams twisted in agony, echoing hauntingly between the trees. She was tormenting him, he realized, using the suffering of his lost companions to weaken his resolve, trying to break him before their final confrontation. Yet Eirik pressed on, gripping the strange blade tighter with every agonized voice he heard. He wrote how it guided him unerringly through the maze of shifting shadows, as though forged precisely for this purpose, to cut through illusions, to defy the Hollow Queen herself. Eventually, he found himself back at the rune-carved arch deep in the forest, the heart of the Queen's power. She stood beneath it, her beauty now fully revealed as monstrous, twisted by the forest she controlled. Her silver hair hung limp, tangled with vines, her hollow back exposed, rotting and empty, filled only with shadows and decay.
You think you can defeat me?
She mocked softly, eyes glistening coldly beneath the moonlight.
Countless warriors have tried, yet here I remain, stronger with each passing season.
I'm not here to defeat you.
Eirik replied steadily, raising the glowing blade between them.
I'm here to free them! All those souls trapped in your forest.
She laughed bitterly, eyes narrowing dangerously.
They are mine, Eirik, just as you shall be mine.
As she spoke, shadows erupted from the ground, twisting into shapes of men. His men, but changed, monstrous, hollow-eyed. They stumbled toward him, their faces pleading silently, even as their bodies obeyed her commands, reaching out, with hands like twisted branches, eager to drag him down with them. Eirik hesitated, heart breaking at the sight, but knew what he had to do. The blade flared brightly, as though sensing his resolve, and he charged forward, fighting his way through the tortured souls that once fought bravely at his side. With each swing of the weapon, the shadows dissipated into smoke, releasing tortured sighs of relief and whispered gratitude.
You cannot free them all.
The Hollow Queen shrieked furiously, her calm facade finally shattered.
They belong to me, forever.
But Eirik kept fighting, driven not by hope, but by a promise he'd made silently. A promise to every lost man who once stood loyal at his side. His last words on the page were bold, etched with conviction, inked in defiance.
She believes I fight to survive. I fight for redemption. Even if my bones become part of this cursed forest, I will not leave my men behind.
I lowered the journal slowly, feeling tears burn in my eyes, unexpectedly moved by Eirik's determination. But as I sat there, caught up in his desperate battle, I became acutely aware of the whispers returning outside my cabin. Soft laughter mixed with something darker, a presence patiently watching, waiting for my own resolve to falter. My heart pounded relentlessly as I turned another page, knowing Eirik's final struggle was nearing its inevitable climax. His handwriting now carried fierce, unyielding strokes, as though each letter were a blade swung defiantly in the face of despair. Eirik described his furious battle against the Hollow Queen's shadows, his ancient blade cleaving through the twisted remnants of his former companions. With every strike, he released another tortured soul, their whispers of thanks blending into a sorrowful chorus, haunting but resolute. Yet each victory drained him, exhaustion creeping steadily into his muscles, threatening to collapse him to the forest floor. The Hollow Queen, her patience finally shattered, approached him with terrifying grace, shadows swirling furiously around her. Her eyes were no longer gentle. They burned with a fury centuries in the making.
You fight bravely, but it means nothing.
She hissed.
Each life you free has strengthened my hold on your own. You will take their place, bound to this forest, a guardian of my solitude for eternity.
Eirik raised his blade defiantly, even as his limbs trembled with fatigue.
Never.
He whispered fiercely.
You've preyed on suffering long enough. It ends tonight.
With a scream of rage, the Hollow Queen lunged forward, shadows coalescing into claws, branches bending to strike at Eirik from every side. He wrote of barely dodging her relentless assault, the blade his only shield, each desperate parry weakening him further. He knew he could not fight forever, not against a force so ancient, so relentless. Yet, in that hopeless moment, clarity struck him. The Hollow Queen and the forest were one, bound by something far older and darker than simple enchantment. The rune-carved arch, pulsing with eldritch power, was the heart of her strength, the nexus of her eternal curse. Realizing this, Eirik gathered every ounce of remaining strength, sprinting through the chaos toward the arch. The queen, recognizing his intent, shrieked in desperation, shadows reaching frantically to stop him. He felt them tear at his skin, clawing to pull him down. Yet he pressed onward, determined beyond pain. Reaching the ancient stone, he raised the blade high above his head, preparing for a final, desperate strike. The Hollow Queen's scream pierced his ears, filled with anguish and hatred, echoing through the forest like a death knell.
You doom yourself, Eirik.
She wailed, voice twisted with despair.
Destroy me, and you will be trapped forever.
He paused for a fraction of a second, her words striking deep. He knew the cost of this blow, but his hesitation vanished as swiftly as it came. He remembered Bjorn's last words, the voices of his lost men, and understood the sacrifice required of him. With a final cry of defiance, he drove the blade deep into the rune-carved stone. The forest exploded in blinding light, power surging outward with a force that knocked him backward, stealing the breath from his lungs. His final scrawled words on that page echoed hauntingly.
The trees burn with fury. If I must become part of this forest to break her curse, then so be it. I embrace eternity, knowing my men are free.
I closed the journal again, feeling an unexplainable sorrow mixed with pride. Eirik's sacrifice rippling through time, touching my heart centuries later. Yet, even in that moment, something felt unfinished, as if the Hollow Queen's story had not truly ended on that night long ago. Outside my cabin window, the trees swayed gently, branches whispering softly as though echoing Eirik's sacrifice, or perhaps mocking it. I took a slow breath before turning another fragile page, sensing that Eirik's story had now entered its final, darkest act. His handwriting grew faint, uncertain, as though each word drained him. Yet I felt compelled to continue, to see his journey through to its bitter end, no matter the cost. Eirik described awakening amid smoldering trees and scorched earth, the forest around him charred and lifeless, the vibrant darkness replaced by ash-gray ruin. His body ached, every breath burning his lungs. But his first thought was not of himself, only of the Hollow Queen. Was she truly gone? Had his sacrifice been enough? He rose shakily, leaning on the ancient blade for support. Yet even as he stood, something felt wrong. He glanced down, horror creeping through his chest. His skin bore markings like twisting vines, glowing faintly green, as though the runes from the arch now lived within him. Panic surged briefly, but was quickly replaced by grim resignation. He understood the truth. In breaking the Hollow Queen's hold, he had become part of the forest, the guardian he had vowed never to become. Yet the whispers were silent now. The forest's hold weakened, if not entirely destroyed. He wandered aimlessly through the wreckage, hoping desperately to find signs of his companions, freed souls, or perhaps survivors, but found only silence and the burned remains of a world forever changed by his choices. As night fell again, Eirik returned to the clearing where the rune-carved arch once stood. In its place lay shattered stone, cracked and lifeless, but something else waited there. A faint, shimmering form, familiar, yet changed. The Hollow Queen knelt amidst the rubble, translucent and fading, no longer monstrous, her eyes filled with a profound sadness.
You have broken the curse,
She whispered softly, her voice barely audible.
but you will carry its burden forever. This place will hold you now, as it held me.
Eirik stepped closer, blade lowered, watching her warily.
Then I have failed. My men may be free, but I remain imprisoned.
She smiled gently, sorrowfully.
No, brave warrior. You have succeeded beyond measure. The forest no longer hungers. My curse has ended. Only echoes remain.
Eirik's writing turned mournful as he recorded her final words.
You must remain here, guardian of the woods, forever bound by sacrifice. But your story, the courage you showed, the pain you endured, will live on, carried by whispers in the wind, waiting to find ears willing to listen.
Then she faded slowly into the darkness, leaving only silence in her wake. Eirik's next words struck deep, shaking me as I read.
My time is ending. I feel myself becoming part of the trees, my flesh and bone, surrendering to bark and roots. I write these final words, knowing that someday another will read them. And when they do, they must understand. The Hollow Queen may be gone, but a forest waits patiently for another to claim its heart.
The final lines blurred before me, my own eyes stinging.
Beware the whispers. Beware the trees. Beware your own heart, lest you become as I am, another guardian trapped forever in this haunted place.
My cabin suddenly felt suffocatingly small, the walls pressing closer, shadows thickening. Outside, the wind rose again, the trees rustling urgently as if echoing Eirik's last warning, a warning that now felt directed entirely at me. I sat quietly for a long moment, the weight of Eirik's words sinking deeply into my chest. I turned the fragile pages slowly, expecting to find a resolution, some final clarity. Instead, I discovered another entry, written hastily in Eirik's familiar, desperate script. He had awakened at dawn, lying amidst the ruins of the rune-carved arch, blades still clutched tightly in his trembling fingers. The forest around him was silent, eerily still, but somehow different, calmer, as though freed from a terrible nightmare. Yet Eirik's heart still ached with uncertainty. Had he truly defeated the Hollow Queen, or merely delayed the inevitable? He rose slowly, limbs aching, but determined to find answers. He wrote how the ancient blade, now cool and silent, seemed drained of its former power, as though its purpose had been fulfilled. With the weapon at his side, he stumbled toward the edge of the forest, drawn by instinct toward open skies and sunlight, things he feared he might never see again. Eventually, Eirik broke free from the tree line and stood beneath the pale morning sun, breathing deeply, relief washing over him. But as he turned back one last time, gazing into the shadowed woods, doubt stirred again. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, whispering softly, words he could almost, but not quite, understand. The Hollow Queen's voice echoed distantly in his mind, sorrowful yet oddly comforting.
You have won your freedom today, Eirik, but nothing lasts forever. Remember, every forest has its guardian.
His final lines, scribbled carefully, carried an uneasy warning.
I leave these woods now, but something within tells me the Hollow Queen's story isn't truly over. Beware to those who find these words. This place is patient, and eternity means nothing to trees.
I closed the journal gently, fingers trembling slightly, pulse racing from the weight of Eirik's final words. Outside my cabin, the wind sighed softly through the trees, branches swaying in the moonlight, shadows dancing across the snow-dappled ground. For a moment, I thought I heard a whisper drifting softly toward me, the forest calling gently, perhaps curious, perhaps patient, perhaps testing my own resolve. Yet this time, I stayed where I was, firmly rooted in the safety of my cabin. Eirik's story was a powerful warning. The woods around us were older than memory, older than the stories we told, and perhaps wiser. They watched silently, patiently waiting for the next guardian to step forward. But tonight, at least, it would not be me. I rose slowly and placed the journal safely back onto the shelf, carefully positioning it among the other worn, leather-bound tomes I'd collected over the years, each one another whispered warning, another glimpse into darkness. Eirik had escaped once, though his fate remained uncertain, and somehow that felt more haunting than if he had surrendered fully. Stepping quietly to the window, I stared out into the darkened forest, its trees stretching endlessly into shadows. Part of me wondered if the Hollow Queen was still there, hidden somewhere deep within, sleeping lightly and waiting patiently for the next lost soul to wander close enough to hear her whispers. But tonight, I was safe and grateful for that small mercy. Still, as I extinguished the lantern, plunging the cabin into gentle darkness, a quiet, uneasy thought lingered in my mind. Some stories never truly end. They simply wait, patiently, for someone new to discover them. They say some villages die of famine, others of war. Eirik etched that thought across the margin of a brittle page, ink scored so deep it bled through to the next leaf. I found the entry last night while cataloging his second journal, the one that reeks of wood smoke and salt. Eirik called the settlement Djúpsker, a hamlet wedged between fjord and forest, where the sea ran black beneath knife-edged cliffs. He and 12 warriors reached it in late autumn, lured by smoke on the horizon and the promise of easy plunder before winter. Yet when their keel scraped the beach, they met only drifting ash that settled on their cloaks like gray snow. Huts still stood, doors ajar, goat pens latched from within. Fish hung half-dried on racks, untouched by gulls. Even the wind, Eirik wrote, seemed strangled, as if the sky itself held its breath. The men laughed to mask unease. Each shout felt muffled, swallowed before it could rebound off the cliffs. They fanned out to search. At the well, they found a bucket dangling halfway down the rope, water's surface glass still. By the longhouse hearth, a pot of thick stew lay congealed, ladle upright, steam long fled. The pages tremble where Eirik pressed his quill describing the silence, how it rang louder than any storm he'd weathered. Toward dusk, he climbed a rise overlooking the fjord. There, carved into granite, glimmered a rune, a spear-shaped tear, glowing dull red like embers beneath ash. When his fingertips brushed the groove, the mark pulsed, and he swore he heard a breath deep as the ocean floor. Eirik stumbled back, but the rune kept breathing, slow and deliberate. He ordered camp on the shore, far from that cliff. Even the fearless among them obeyed without protest. Bravado dissolves quickly in a place that refuses to echo your voice. Twilight bled across the water, and from beneath that still black sheet rose a single note, low and resonant, like a war horn blown in some drowned hall. The sound lingered, refusing to fade, circling under the keelboats. No ripples marred the surface. No wind stirred their fire. Only that impossible horn call and the rune behind them, glowing faintly in the dark. Eirik ended the entry with one line, the ink smeared by a shaky hand.
If silence can kill, then sound can summon.
I don't know what answered that summons, but every instinct in me, every whisper this cabin has ever carried, tells me Djúpsker was only the beginning. Eirik wrote that the horn call thickened after nightfall until it felt less like sound and more like pressure inside their skulls, a vibration that set teeth on edge and rattled the iron rivets of their shields. The men built a ring of driftwood fires along the beach, hoping to push back whatever lurked beyond the glow. But the flames burned strangely blue at the edges, as though starved of air. Sparks rose only a hand's breadth before blinking out, swallowed by the smothering hush that clung to Djúpsker. Near midnight, the sea itself answered. A slow, synchronized pulse rippled across the black mirror of the fjord, concentric rings radiating from nowhere, as if an unseen giant lifted and lowered its chest beneath the water. Each surge washed up oily foam that reeked of brine and something sweeter, like rotting lavender. It gathered in veined clots around their boots, and where it touched skin, it left a faint, stinging numbness that crept behind the knuckles. One of the younger oarsmen, Bjarke, cursed and hurled his torch into the tide. The moment the flame hissed out, the surrounding silence rushed inward, filling the gap with an almost tactile weight. The men instinctively stepped closer, crowding Eirik, who alone seemed anchored by grim curiosity. He stooped, scooped a palmful of the lavender-scented foam, and let it trickle through his fingers while he listened, truly listened, to the intervals between horn blasts. He realized they were shortening, like breaths quickening before a roar. They dragged their longships higher onto the sand, but the tide did not retreat. Instead, it seeped forward, grain by grain, until cold water lapped at the keel timbers despite a rising moon. Eirik ordered 2 warriors, Torsten and Leif, to climb the cliff path and scout inland for any sign of life or death that might explain the village's abandonment. They carried horn lanterns and a coil of rope and joked loudly about finding warm beds somewhere above the tree line, yet their voices sounded flat, stolen by that dreadful calm. The journal falls silent for nearly a full page. Only a dark smear near the spine hints at hurried ink. When the words resume, Eirik's hand has grown shaky. Torsten's lantern appeared again at the cliff's edge, just past moon high, but only the lantern returned. The rope came down empty, frayed as if sawed from within. Leave's voice called once, raw, panicked, then cut short, not by distance but mid-syllable, as though the air between had shuttered shut. At the same instant, the carved Tyr rune atop the headland flared from ember to furnace, its red light spilling across the fjord in a thin blade. Every fire on the beach guttered and died, yet the rune glowed brighter, casting shadows that moved the wrong way, stretching toward the light instead of fleeing it. The horn beneath the water blared so loudly the men dropped to their knees, pressing fists against their ears, eyes watering from a pressure that felt ready to split bone. Eirik crawled to the surf and plunged both hands into the foam. He writes that the numbness surged up his arms and froze the very words in his throat, but he forced them out anyway. An oath to whichever god still listened beyond that silence. The fjord answered with a single towering swell that rose, held its shape like glass, then collapsed without a sound, sweeping away their extinguished campfires and leaving the beach scoured clean. When the water receded, something lay at the tide line. Torsten's lantern, shattered, and beside it a strip of rune-etched bark, pale as bone, carved in symbols Eirik did not recognize. Symbols he would later sketch in the margin, shaking so violently the charcoal lines tremble on the page. He notes that the bark was warm to the touch, despite the frigid sand, and it pulsed faintly in time with the rune on the cliff. The men begged to leave at first light, but Eirik's curiosity, his curse, perhaps, anchored them. He needed to know what breath filled that horn beneath the water, what force carved silence into walls higher than any fortress. He believed there was still time to learn, and still a bargain to be struck, because the journal's next words are calm, deliberate, almost hopeful.
At dawn we will climb to the rune and speak whatever name it demands. In knowledge, there is safety.
I paused reading there, unable to shake the sense that Eirik was already bargaining with something that did not trade. It merely collected. Outside the cabin, my own wind chimes had gone still, and for a heartbeat, I thought I felt that same hush pressing at the door, waiting to be invited in. Dawn broke like a dying ember, gray, heatless, yet the Tyr rune atop the cliff still glowed blood red, brighter than any sunrise. Eirik assembled 10 men. 2 refused to climb and stayed to guard the ships, claiming, "The tide sounds wrong." Their voices, small against the soaring rock face, reminded him of children arguing against a storm. The ascent followed goat trails carved into shale. Each footfall struck stone, but made no echo, as though sound drained straight into the mountain. Frost rimed the grass despite a salt-heavy breeze off the fjord. Halfway up they found Leif's helmet wedged between roots, the iron flattened inward, as if clasped by enormous patient hands. No blood stained it, only a damp lavender scent, faint but clinging. Near the summit, the trail narrowed to a ledge barely wider than a man's shoulders. The glow from the rune painted everything scarlet. Their skin looked flayed, eyes gleaming like wet stones. There, recessed in the cliff, stood a doorway framed by stones the size of funeral slabs. No lintel, no carvings, save newer gouges that matched the unknown symbols on the bark strip. The gap yawned black, inhaling torchlight without a flicker. Inside lay a tunnel sloping downward, dry, despite the sea's nearness. Walls shimmered with mica. Each step showered faint sparks that died before touching the floor. The horn call was muted here, transformed into a pulse you felt in bone rather than heard. Eirik paced it with his heartbeat, noting the intervals still shortening. Urgency made rhythmic. The passage emptied into a circular chamber hollowed from basalt. At its center stood a basin cut from the living rock, brimful of perfectly still water that reflected nothing. Even when they leaned close, lantern light vanished beneath the surface as if consumed. Around the basin, 8 stone seats formed a council ring. 7 sat empty. The 8th held what remained of Leave. He was upright, hands on knees, head bowed. Skin porcelain white, veins traced violet beneath. His throat looked untouched, yet his tongue, blackened and brittle, rested in his open palm. Carved into the muscle were those same symbols, sliced with such precision the letters shone through him like ruby glass. Bjarka retched. The sound died an arm span away. Eirik knelt beside Leave, eyes fixed on the tongue rune. He pressed the bark strip against it, the marks aligned perfectly, forming a phrase he could neither read nor forget. He breathed the words once, soft, questioning. The basin answered. Its water convulsed upward in a silent column, twisting itself into the vague shape of a figure cloaked in foam. Where a face might be, the surface rippled outward. Concentric rings of nothingness, pulling vision inward like a whirlpool. The pulse in the walls halted. In the hush that followed, Eirik felt his own heartbeat cease for a single, agonizing instant, as if waiting for permission to continue. The men backed away, but Eirik stood transfixed. A single drop detached from the water figure, hovered, then struck Leave's corpse. Flesh melted like tallow, bones sagging into a puddle that fumed lavender. The water figure extended a limb toward Eirik, no threat in the gesture, merely invitation. And the rune at the cliff above roared back to life, flooding the tunnel with red light. Sound returned all at once, a thunder of rushing tide, the crash of rocks splitting, screams of gulls overhead, though none had flown since their arrival. Eirik tore free, dragging his men toward daylight. As they fled, each torch guttered out, one after another, until only the rune's glow guided them. Emerging onto the clifftop, they found the sea boiling below, ships bobbing like toys, guards nowhere in sight. The rune pulsed faster now, matching the relentless drumming beneath the water, and with every beat, scarlet fissures spiderwebbed across the stone basin roof, still hidden behind them. He ordered a retreat to the beach, but the cliff path had vanished, erased as if scrubbed from the world. Where shale steps once clung, there was only sheer drop and the beating silence of the rune-demanding audience. Eirik turned inland, toward dense pine rising beyond the headland, praying the forest still obeyed mortal geometry. His last line on the page before ink trails off.
The silence follows. It wears our names.
I closed the journal and listened. Outside my cabin, the wind had died entirely, yet the old chimes on the porch trembled. Not ringing, just quivering, as though remembering a sound they no longer dared to make. Eirik led his dwindling band into the pines, hoping the forest would swallow them faster than the rune's silence. Mist drifted between the trunks, dense enough to soften every outline, yet thin enough to show what needed hiding. Entire swathes of bark peeled away in perfect, spear-shaped lines, each one glowing faintly from within. The tear symbol had spread like a fever through living wood. The warriors soon discovered the ground betrayed them. Wherever their boots pressed, the moss rebounded without a trace. No footprints, no snapped twigs, nothing to mark direction. Worse, every path curved inward, steering them back toward the cliff despite their compass of stars. The hush grew elastic, stretching between heartbeats, until speech required effort. When Hrolf tried to pray, his voice emerged as someone else's whisper, 2 octaves lower, speaking words none of them understood. Terror snapped his courage. He fled into the timber and vanished without even the crunch of needles underfoot. Hour by hour, their company thinned. Some men drifted away as if chasing phantom campfires. Others simply halted and stared skyward until the lavender scent poured from their mouths like smoke, and they toppled silently among the roots. Eirik forced the survivors into a tight ring, torches jammed between shield rims to create a hedge of light. He made them recite their own names. I am Sigrun's son. I am Ketil of the 3 fjords, over and over, clinging to identity the way sailors cling to wreckage. The ritual shored them just long enough to reach a clearing, paved with stones older than any Viking carving. 7 monoliths stood in a circle, each bearing a faint groove where a seat might once have been, mirroring the council ring below the cliff. In the center, moss concealed a shallow depression exactly the size of the basin carved into the tunnel floor. Eirik knelt, brushed aside the green, and found only dry earth. No water, no reflection. Yet when he leaned close, his breath rippled across it as though over glass. A sudden gust swept the clearing, bending pines outward in a perfect sphere. From every direction at once came the undersea horn, now pitched so low the ground vibrated. The men staggered, teeth rattled, torches snapped into blue flame before extinguishing altogether. Darkness fell, but not complete. The monoliths began to glow from within, their runes lighting in sequence until the circle pulsed like a colossal heart. Eirik understood. The rune on the cliff, the basin below, the seats in this forgotten grove, they were pieces of a single engine, and Djúpsker nothing more than the shell it wore while sleeping. He thrust the bark strip into the glowing soil and shouted the phrase he had traced upon Leave's tongue. The horn ceased instantly. For one breath, the silence lifted, true silence, filled only by the ragged relief of living men. Then the earth answered with a sigh so ancient, it felt like the exhale of mountains. The clearing dropped, not caved, not split, dropped, as though the world's skin loosened and a deeper layer slid forward. The monoliths sank waist deep, light bleeding upward into a column that swallowed the survivors. Eirik's notes blur here, the charcoal smeared by shaking fingers.
They fell, but they did not fall into dark. They fell into memory, and memory kept no ground.
When the glow faded, Eirik found himself alone beside the stone circle, torches spent, voices gone. In the basin's hollow lay only his own reflection, no longer mirrored, just staring up from dirt as if from the bottom of an unseen sea. He broke at last, scattering the remaining journal pages across the clearing and striking flint until sparks caught. Flame licked the parchment, but instead of smoke, it released a fine lavender vapor that drifted skyward and hung, unmoving, like a reversed waterfall. Eirik's final line that night reads,
I burned the record, yet the air remembers every word.
The page edges charred under his quill, and the next begins at dawn, with fewer names, a thinner script, and the runes still pulsing beneath the ground. By the next day's entry, Eirik writes as if speaking through clenched teeth, sentences shortened, ink bitten into the page. At dawn, he counted 5 men alive. By dusk, only 3 walked beside him, and even their names felt brittle in his mouth. The forest paths refused to hold a straight line. Whichever direction they chose curved back toward the sea, forcing them ever nearer the cliff that still throbbed beneath its rune. That night, the trees began to hum. Not a melody, but a resonance. The same submerged horn transposed into living wood. Needles shivered, trunks quivered, and wherever bark had been flayed, the glow bled brighter, beating like hundreds of hidden hearts. Eirik's remaining companions, Bjarke, Ketil, and Old Ulf, dropped to their knees, palms pressed against ears, yet the sound tunneled straight through flesh. Ketil screamed once, the syllable torn in half as though sliced from the air. When silence returned, he knelt motionless, eyes filmed with lavender resin that seeped from tear ducts and hardened to glass. The others left him there, a statue listening forever. Eirik and Bjarke dragged Ulf through the underbrush until they broke from pine into salt-scrubbed heath overlooking the fjord. What they saw should have been impossible. The shoreline folded in on itself, curving like a question mark, so that the longships now faced inland, prows pointing toward the mountains rather than the sea. The fjord behind them stretched straight as a sword, yet the geography around the ships had twisted, reality bowing to some deeper contour. Closer still, a new shape jutted from the water, where the clearing basin ought to align, a basalt pillar, smooth and wet, capped by the same spear-split rune. Around its base, water boiled without steam, each bubble releasing a sighing consonant, as if language fermented beneath the waves. Eirik realized the engine was rising, building itself upward through layers of world. Basin below, monoliths in the grove, pillar at the shore, and above them all the original rune thrumming in the cliff. A ladder of silence, rung by rung, climbing towards something that waited to descend. Ulf, delirious, crawled toward the water, whispering that the pillar bore his mother's voice. Bjarke tried to haul him back, but Ulf's skin sloughed where hands gripped, thin as parchment, lifting away to reveal lavender glow beneath. The old warrior begged them to listen.
"It only wants what we forget,"
he gasped, then slipped from Bjarke's grasp and walked into the boiling tide. Where foam touched him, he dissolved into mist, each droplet ringing like a distant bell before vanishing. Bjarke broke then, rage, grief, pure terror. He hurled his axe at the pillar. The moment steel struck stone, every rune in sight flared white-hot, and the fjord inhaled. The water sank a full fathom in a single breath, exposing slick rock ribs along the shore. At their tips, skeletal shapes clung, half coral, half bone, each bearing slit mouths that opened and closed without sound. They turned as one toward Eirik and Bjarke, not hostile, merely expectant, like worshippers awaiting sermon. Eirik felt the hush building again, that terrible vacuum before a storm, but this time he recognized its cadence. It matched the intervals between his own heartbeats. The engine wasn't summoning something distant. It was tuning the world to a resonance already inside every living thing. He understood then why the village died without violence, why sound itself betrayed them. The rune was teaching reality to forget noise, to forget difference, until only a single perfect note remained. He dragged Bjarke away, feet slipping on receding water, and found himself at the mouth of a ravine he'd never seen marked on any chart. Black stone walls rose slick with salt, and deep within, the horn sounded. Not a pulse now, but a full, drawn-out call that made the ravine mouth shimmer like heat haze. Eirik braced himself, stepped forward, and the journal's ink breaks, leaving only a smear where a line might have begun. I lowered the page, throat dry. At that exact moment, a tremor rattled my cabin window, glass I'd replaced just last week. Outside, the forest stood motionless, yet a low vibration pressed through the walls, aligning with my pulse. My wind chimes suddenly chimed a single note, clear and hollow. The sound cut off mid-ring, as though pinched shut. The ravine swallowed Eirik and Bjarke in damp twilight, its walls slick with salt, like the gullet of some ancient creature. Each step rang faintly, then faded as the air drank the echo. Ahead, the stone throat widened into a cavern so vast, the torch glow barely scraped its ceiling. At its heart rose a column of water suspended in midair, a living spear that pulsed with the same red light as the cliff rune. Every beat sent ripples through the column, and with each ripple the silence tightened, squeezing breath from lung and thought from mind. Marble platforms circled the water spear, forming tiers like seating in a vanished amphitheater. Upon the lowest tier lay Bjarka's axe, its iron head half melted, runic haft smoldering lavender smoke. Bjarka staggered toward it, muttering that he could still hear Ulf calling from inside the blade. Eirik seized his arm, but Bjarka lurched free, stepping onto the foremost platform. The cavern answered. Thin blades of water sliced outward from the spear like ribs unfolding, each one reflecting nothing, pure absence shaped as glass. They curved around Bjarka, closing with the inevitability of tide. Eirik shouted his comrade's name, but sound slipped past his lips, swallowed before birth. Bjarka raised the damaged axe as if to parry, yet the ribs met without resistance. His outline wavered, split, and folded inward. Man in shadow, dissolving into the column without a ripple. Where Bjarka vanished, a new rune flared along the water spear's length. Not tear now, but something older, its lines crooked like broken bone reknitted wrong. The pillar brightened, and with that brightness, Eirik felt memories tear loose from his mind. Scraps of childhood, the taste of birch sap, his sister's laugh. They drifted toward the spear in glowing threads, weaving themselves into that alien glyph until it throbbed with stolen life. Eirik recoiled, slapped his own temples to anchor thought, then did the unthinkable. He drew his sayax and carved the edges of his palms, letting blood spatter the stone. The crimson drops made sound, tiny hisses that survived the hush, and where each drop struck, the marble cracked, spiderwebbing outward, disrupting the perfect circle. The spear quivered. A resonant moan filled the chamber, first within stone, then within flesh. Eirik pressed his bleeding palms against the cracking marble and bellowed every name he could still recall. His mother's, his drowned war brothers, etched into silence like a blade against cloth. Each name landed like a hammer blow. The circle fragmented, pieces sloughing into the dark below. The water spear shuddered once, twice, then collapsed in on itself, imploding into a whirlpool of mist that roared without sound. In that void, Eirik glimpsed shapes, pale villagers, warriors, nameless figures merging and dividing like clouds, every memory the rune had devoured, swirling in search of form. He cast his blood-slick sayax into the maelstrom. Metal struck something solid. The whirl stuttered, then burst upward in a lavender plume that battered the cavern roof and rained memory ash around him. He fled blind through the ravine, deafened by the surge of silence breaking. Because silence can break, and when it does, it sounds like the earth inhaling fire. He reached the warped shoreline at dawn to find the rune on the cliff dark. Its glow extinguished, the pillar gone. The fjord lay smooth again, but where water met land, new stone bloomed, fresh basalt still steaming, etched in the twisted glyph that had devoured Bjarka. Eirik's entry ends there. The page edge is scorched, the ink blurred as if waterlogged, yet his final line stands clear.
I shattered its voice, but its shape remains. Buried beneath each name I bled. If anyone reads, carve no sound into stone. Only silence will spare you.
I closed the journal, blood rushing in my ears. Outside, the chimes were still, yet from beneath the cabin floorboards came a faint drip, steady as a heartbeat, smelling of lavender. One part remains, and I fear finishing it will etch that glyph onto my own tongue. But if I stop, the hush at my door may speak for me. The final journal leaf is half gone, edges singed, ink mottled. but the words that remain feel carved into me as I read.
The glyph lives now in places that remember no sound, still ponds, unshaken snow, the breath between heartbeats. Break mirrors if they speak, salt every threshold, and when the silence settles, hold your name like a weapon.
Outside, that lavender drip has thickened to a slow trickle beneath the floorboards. I lift a loose plank. The wood is damp, yet the earth below looks dry, cracked in the exact spear-split shape of tear. Each fissure exhales a hush that swallows the creak of the boards, the hum of the cabin lights, even the crackle of the old hearth's embers. Above me, the wind chimes hang motionless, but their shadows stretch toward the rune as though drawn by unseen tide. I fetch a hammer, intent on sealing the gap, but the moment iron meets plank, the hush tightens, an invisible wire around my throat. A drop of moisture splashes the hammerhead and hisses like quenched steel. Where it lands, the metal dulls, pitted with symbols too small for any chisel. They match the marks on Leave's tongue, on Bjarke's vanished outline, on the pillar that rose from the fjord. The silence presses harder. My heartbeat staggers, then aligns with a slow, distant pulse echoing through the soil. It isn't coming from outside. It's resonating in my own bones. I remember Eirik's warning, carve no sound into stone, and realize I've done something worse. I've spoken his story aloud, etching it into every listener's mind. Words are softer than stone, yet they spread further and hold longer. If the glyph feeds on memory, I've just fed it a feast. The hush slackens, as if satisfied, then recedes below the floorboards. The lavender seep vanishes, leaving only the faint scent of wilted flowers. For now, the cabin breathes again. I nail the planks shut anyway. Then I lock the journal away, seal it in salt, and pray that sharing this account hasn't granted the engine a new rung to climb. But as I finish these words, my recording monitor flickers, and in the dead air between ticks of the clock, I hear a single hollow note, low, patient, waiting to be remembered. Some silences aren't emptiness, they're invitations. If this story left you with a lingering chill, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story from Eirik's journal. And tell me, if a forgotten name began whispering beneath your floorboards, would you dare answer? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching Cabin of Whispers. See you next time.